And then Joel will be doing his YouTube feed. All right, so we are live. All right, welcome to the Mentionables First National Conference, Day 2. We want to welcome everyone that's watching online and in person. Thank you guys for coming out. We really do appreciate it. Today's debate is going to be between Tyler and Ben.
You got it.
3 letters. I can do this. So anyway, we do thank you. We'll have the official introduction soon. But stay tuned. Again, this is a conference. Please, if you're in the Greensboro area, come out and see us. Give me a second. Let me set the camera.
And for everyone that just came in, there are handouts right here below the camera for everyone. I don't have handouts, so I'll give out like 3 hugs. I will charge per hug.
The handout basically demonstrates what's going on.
Alrighty, the camera is live and recording.
All right. Morning, everybody. This is the first day of the Mentionables Conference.
Turn the mic on.
The second day of the Mentionables Conference. What do you need me to do there, John?
Is the mic on?
I don't know.
Is there a green light
mic
on?
Yeah,
Okay.
it is. So, today's event, we'll have a lot of speakers and classes, but the primary event is this morning we're going to have a debate between Benjamin Watkins and Tyler Vela here, moderated by Chad Gross. Chad Gross is of Truth Bomb Apologetics. Tyler Vela is from the Free Thinker, and Benjamin Watkins is for Relay Theology. So Benjamin Watkins is our atheist presenter today, and the topic under discussion is going to be whether God is the appropriate explanation or the sufficient explanation for suffering and evil in the world. Did I get that right? Yeah. Okay. Tyler will be taking the assenting position, saying that God is the sufficient explanation, and Benjamin will be taking the dissenting position that God does not explain or is not a good explanation for suffering and evil. I'll let them present their cases. Tyler Vela, again, is of the Free Thinker. He's got a lot of experience in presenting, and again, he does the Free Thinker podcast and some blogging on that as well. Benjamin is the host of the Real Atheology podcast, and he himself is a philosopher, working on becoming a professional philosopher, in fact. And then Chad does the Truth Bomb Apologetics blog, and he participates sometimes in the podcast for the Mentionables. And he's very connected in the apologetics world, as it turns out. So I'll let Chad take the mic.
Good morning. I am really excited about this debate. I've had the opportunity to read both of these gentlemen's opening statements, and they have done just such a wonderful job preparing for this. And they were both just a treat to read. And last night we were able to really interact with each other through a discussion panel, and it was just a lot of great fun. And I think what you're going to see today for a debate is really, before the debate even happens, I'm confident in saying that this is how theists and atheists should try to pattern their debates, try to understand each other's position and respect each other's position. And I'm just really thrilled and honored to be a part of it. I just wanted to start out before we get going, and Ben comes up and opens up the debate. I wanted to make sure that everybody knew kind of the layout of the debate. They're both going to start with 25-minute opening statements, and then we're going to move into a moderated discussion period. And my goal during the moderated discussion period, and I've already told both of them this, is to stay out of the way as much as possible and to let them interact and talk. And that'll be me guiding them with some questions, and then they're also going to be able to question each other a little bit too as the discussion leads. And then they are going to have 5-minute closing statements. And then finally there'll be an audience Q&A where you'll have the opportunity to ask both of the speakers any questions you may have. So I'd encourage you during the debate, make sure that you're writing down any questions. And I am going to say, and I'll give a little bit more direction when we get to this section of the debate, hopefully, that we are asking for questions. We're not asking for stories. We're not asking for short narratives. And you are not the debater today. So don't start a debate with one of the speakers. It is just to ask a succinct question. So if you have a question, make sure you can ask it in about 30 seconds and make sure it's ready and prepared. And then during that Q&A, just for a little bit more time, the person the question is posed to, say if it's posed to Ben will have 3 minutes, about 3 minutes to respond, and then Tyler will have a 1-minute rejoinder. What they're going to be arguing today is Ben's major contention is that biblical theism does not make good sense of the facts of suffering. Tyler will be arguing that biblical theism does make good sense of facts about suffering. And I would encourage you just not to be picky at all, but please make sure that your cell phone is off. We are recording, and we want to make sure we have some good audio, so please make sure that those are off so that we can respect these gentlemen. And so I would like now to invite Ben Watkins of Early Theology to come to the podium and for his opening statement. Thank you, Ben. Welcome.
Thank you, Chad, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Benjamin Watkins, and I want to start off by thanking Tyler Vela for inviting me here and for the organizers for putting on this debate. Everyone has been super friendly and just very welcoming, and I'm very honored to be here and to call all of you my friend. Tyler is a good friend of mine, and whom I've enjoyed many discussions with, and I hope that today is no exception. One of my primary aims tonight is to constructively add to what I call the great debate about the existence of God. I strongly believe that both sides should approach these questions seriously and with humility and an open mind. I'm fond of saying that we have nothing to lose and everything to gain from an honest pursuit of truth for its own sake. Questions within the great debate are important because the answers we accept to them will greatly influence our lives. Not only are these questions important, but they are also interesting to discuss because the philosophy of religion raises many other interesting questions about meaning, morality, and mind. Tonight, Tyler and I have been asked to discuss the question, does the God of the Bible best explain facts about suffering? My answer to this question will be no. Over the course of my journey through the great debate, I have come to believe that there are good reasons to believe that atheism is true. Facts about suffering, I believe, give us some of those reasons. Next slide, please. The argument I will put forward tonight is nothing more than the well-worn problem of evil. An important question raised by suffering is whether or not the world contains undesirable states of affairs that count against our believing there exists a perfect being, such as God. Admittedly, the label problem of evil is in at least one way misleading. There is no single problem of evil, but rather a family of related problems. This is important to note at the start because it implies that no single solution is likely to solve them all. I will lay out some of these problems and leave it to you to judge how well Tyler's responses solve them. For now, I want to turn our attention to some claims that will be made tonight. I have included these claims on a handout that I have passed out to all the audience members today, because these are the claims I want you to leave here with tonight, and I want you to reflect on them in the coming days. Next slide. First, what is Tyler essentially claiming? Prior to this debate, Tyler and I agreed on claims each of us would be making so as to reduce any confusion or misunderstandings. Tyler's main claim that I will mostly focus on is that biblical theism does make good sense of facts about suffering. That is the case I expect Tyler to make when reflecting on the reason-giving facts.
Oh, I say go away, boy, you bother me.
Us that biblical theism helps us to understand or make sense of these facts. But Tyler, bold as he is, does not stop there. He will also be defending the further claim that biblical theism is the best explanation for facts about suffering. In other words, it is superior to all other rival hypotheses. This is a tall order indeed. Again, I will leave it up to you to decide whether or not his case succeeds. I will obviously be arguing... next slide, sorry. I will obviously be arguing contrary to Tyler. My main claim is that biblical theism does not make good sense of facts about suffering. Additionally, I will argue that there is a simpler and more accurate hypothesis which better explains facts about suffering. I will outline this hypothesis shortly, but first I want to unpack the concepts in play here. And there is no better place to start than with the concept of God. Next slide. The first concept I want to explore is that of a supernatural agent. A supernatural agent is supernatural in the sense of being a disembodied, non-natural being, and an agent in the sense of having a rational mind that can have thoughts, beliefs, make choices between alternatives, and perform other intentional actions that causally influence the world. According to what I'll call the supernatural agent thesis, God is a single disembodied mind that causally interacts with the world. Next slide. So the supernatural agent thesis will be the first part of our concept of God. This concept should be familiar, as it's the sort of being that is the conclusions of most cosmological and teleological arguments, such as the designer God of intelligent design, or deism. Next slide. The next concept I want to discuss is arguably the most important, the standard perfect being model. This concept is what implies that God is wholly worthy of our worship, the greatest possible being, or a maximally great being. According to what I'll call the perfect being thesis, God is a perfect and personal being who is always worthy of our worship. Such a being would have the essential divine properties of infinite power, perfect knowledge, perfect goodness, and perfect love. Let's take a closer look at these four divine properties. Next slide. First up is infinite power. According to what I'll call God's omnipotence, God has the ability to perform any logically possible act of which the description is coherent. God is only restricted by logical limitations. So there is no paradox of the stone today. Next slide. Next is God's perfect knowledge. According to what I'll call God's omniscience, God could only have true beliefs about the world and about what matters. In other words, God would know all true propositions. Next slide. Next is God's perfect goodness. According to what I'll call God's moral perfection, God would always perform morally permissible acts, never perform any morally wrong acts, and would always fulfill his moral obligations and would possess an unsurpassable set of character virtues. In other words, God would aim to create a world that was worth creating for its own sake. He would desire for things to go best, and he would never be blameworthy for any act he performs in the world he has created. Next slide. The last divine property I want to discuss is perfect love. I believe this is an all too often neglected divine property that we ought to pay attention to more to. According to what I'll call God's divine love, God's love for finite creatures would be infinite and inexhaustible. Such love would involve universal benevolence towards and universal caring for the well-being of finite creatures. The concept of divine love I have in mind is analogous to our concept of a perfectly loving parent and her relation to her child. We all too often conceive of God with emphasis on his masculine properties like power, but I think we should also emphasize God's maternal aspects, such as love and compassion. Next slide. So far, we've built our biblical hypothesis on the supernatural agent thesis and the perfect being thesis, but we haven't included anything which ties these claims to the God of the Bible, which is what is important for tonight's debate. For that, we need a biblical thesis. Next slide. According to what I'll call the biblical thesis, the only perfect and personal disembodied mind who is always worthy of our worship is the God of the Bible. To be sure, there is widespread disagreement about the additional content of biblical theism, and I will not attempt to settle any of those disputes here tonight. However, there are some relatively uncontroversial claims which surely belong to any biblical hypothesis. For example, the biblical God is a Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The biblical God has revealed himself through the person of Jesus Christ. There is an afterlife, and the only way to gain access is through belief and acceptance of Jesus Christ. And man is in a state of rebellion against God and lives in a fallen world because it suffers from original sin. Next slide. Now that we have our three theses clearly laid out, we can construct a working biblical God concept. So I will understand the biblical God as a single, disembodied mind who causally interacts with the natural world, is a perfect and personal being always worthy of our worship, and is identical to the central figure described in the Bible. Next slide. So we will need to construct a working hypothesis using this God concept. And I will come to that shortly. But first, I think it's important to distinguish the concept of God from any hypothesis which uses that concept. Because the properties we ascribe to God have implications. And these implications constrain what our explanatory hypothesis would predict the world to be like if it were created by such a being. We should ask ourselves, how would we predict the world to appear if it were created by a being such as God? I cannot emphasize enough just how important this question is, as it will be a major driving force of my reasoning when we try to explain facts about suffering later on. The philosopher of religion, J.L. Schellenberg, puts it like this. We have all of us been influenced by the many attempts of theology to make God fit the actual world. Theology starts off by accepting that God exists, and so has to make God fit the world. In a way, that is its job. But our job as philosophers, faced with the question of God's existence, is to fight free from the distractions of local and historical contingency, to let the voice of authority grow dim in our ears, and to think for ourselves what a God and a God-created world would be like. Before I lay out the explanatory hypothesis that will be under consideration, I want to say a few things about the nature of explanation in general. What does it mean to say that some explanation is better than another? Or that some set of facts counts as evidence for one hypothesis or against another? When I claim that some set of facts is evidence for some hypothesis or is better explained by some hypothesis, I mean those facts enhance the reasonableness of the hypothesis. The reasonableness of a hypothesis is determined by its simplicity and its explanatory accuracy with respect to the relevant facts, i.e. its ability to predict or retroject the data in question. The simplicity of hypothesis is determined by its modesty, coherence, and nothing else. With these explanatory considerations in mind, we are now ready to construct our explanatory hypothesis. Next slide. For review, here is how we built the hypothesis of biblical theism. What's important to remember here is that biblical theism is built on at least three essential claims: the supernatural agent thesis, the perfect being thesis, and the biblical thesis. These three combined theses are what, by hypothesis, are meant to explain facts about suffering. Next slide. I will be comparing the explanatory merits of biblical theism with my own hypothesis. According to what I'll call universal cosmic indifference, or UCI for short, sentient life in the cosmos is not the result of malevolent or benevolent acts by disembodied persons. Note that universal cosmic indifference is logically incompatible with biblical theism, and, if true, would imply atheism is true, in a belief-implying sense. The intuitions I want to concentrate on are: the world seems indifferent to our existence. Biblical theism implies that the world is not indifferent to our existence. Therefore, we have some reason to doubt Tyler's claim that biblical theism is a good explanation for facts about suffering. To quote Carl Sagan, the universe seems neither benign nor hostile, simply indifferent. To press these intuitions, I will make two additional claims. Next slide. According to what I'll call theoretical simplicity, universal cosmic indifference is a much more simple explanation of biblical theism. And according to what I'll call theoretical accuracy, universal cosmic indifference is a much more accurate explanation than biblical theism with respect to facts about suffering. Let's unpack theoretical simplicity first by understanding the theoretical virtues of modesty and coherence. Next slide. According to what I'll call theoretical modesty, if some hypothesis is more modest than another, then this hypothesis has less content that is not merely part of our background knowledge and is not known by rational intuition alone. All else being equal, the hypothesis with more content is more likely to be claiming something false, making it less likely to be true. Recall that universal cosmic indifference makes a single claim, but biblical theism makes more claims that are also broader in scope. 1, the supernatural thesis, 2, the perfect being thesis, and 3, the biblical thesis. Also recall, biblical theism also makes many more specific claims we saw earlier, such as the claims about Jesus' resurrection, original sin, and the Trinity. Next slide. We can see this visually by examining the entailment relations between the three theses that biblical theism makes use of. There are at least 3 distinct ways in which biblical theism could be false. First, any of the essential theological claims of biblical theism are false, then biblical theism is false. Perhaps Allah, the God of Islam, is the only perfect being always worthy of our worship. Second, if the perfect being thesis is false, then biblical theism is false. Perhaps some form of deism or polytheism is true. And finally, if the supernatural agent thesis is false, then the biblical thesis and the perfect being thesis are false. For example, perhaps some form of pantheism or metaphysical naturalism is true. By contrast, there is only one way for my hypothesis to be false. Life must be the result of a disembodied mind that cares about sentient suffering. These claims, I argue, give us sufficient reason to believe that my hypothesis of universal cosmic indifference is much more modest than biblical theism. Next slide. Next up is coherence. According to what I'll call theoretical coherence, if some hypothesis is more coherent than another, then this hypothesis' parts fit together better. All else being equal, the better the parts of a hypothesis fit together, the more likely it is to be true. Next slide. So do the parts of biblical theism fit together well? It should be no surprise that I do not believe that they do. For example, does the Bible contain internal contradictions? Is biblical theism in tension with our best scientific and philosophical explanations? Does our conception of God contain incompatible properties, like perfect justice and unsurpassable mercy? Are the biblical thesis and the perfect being thesis in tension with one another? I won't be able to address all of these questions tonight, but I do want to take a closer look at this last question to help illustrate my point. According to what I'll call the incoherence of biblical theism, there is a deep tension between the perfect being thesis and the biblical thesis. These parts of biblical theism do not seem to fit coherently well together. Next slide. The incoherence of biblical theism can be illustrated with the following inconsistent tetrad, which I have included on the handout. The first is the acts of God can be neither morally wrong nor unloving, which is implied by the perfect being thesis. Two, the Bible is generally a reliable account of the acts of God, which is implied by the biblical thesis. 3, the Bible describes God apparently causing, condoning, or commanding undeserved and uncompensated suffering, which is also implied by the biblical thesis. And 4, it seems morally wrong and unloving to cause, condone, or command undeserved and uncompensated suffering, which is a plausible moral principle. If we accept any of these 3 claims, then we can derive the falsity of the 4th. In other words, these parts of biblical theism do not fit well together. We cannot accept all 4 of them without tension. These potential issues of coherence and the previously mentioned theoretical virtue of modesty, I argue, count against biblical theism a priori. But what about a posteriori considerations? For that, we can now turn to explanatory accuracy. Next slide. According to what I'll call explanatory accuracy, some hypothesis is more accurate than another if it is better at predicting or retrodicting the data in question. All else being equal, the more accurate hypothesis is more likely to be true. So the data for today's discussion are facts about suffering. All parties to the discussion should be able to agree that the world contains a lot of seemingly pointless and gratuitous suffering. Additionally, there seem to be a wide variety of different kinds of suffering, such as moral and natural suffering, as well as human and non-human suffering. The distribution of suffering in our world also seems largely random. Suffering afflicts the just and the unjust alike. I want to demarcate 3 kinds of suffering which I believe count against biblical theism and count in favor of my hypothesis of universal cosmic indifference. Next slide. First, there is the biological goal of pain. Our experiences of pain and those of other non-human animals are systematically connected to the biological goals of temporary survival and reproduction. Our experiences of pain and those of other non-human animals are not systematically connected to the moral goals of character building, the quest for meaning, or the attainment of happiness. The long process of biological evolution is a chaotic, inefficient, and inevitably cruel means for producing sentient life. Next slide. Additionally, the distribution of pain in the universe appears to be mostly random and devoid of any morally instrumental value. We now turn to our important question. Given these facts, how would we predict the world to appear if it were created by God? If my hypothesis is true, then there is no reason to predict sentient life would evolve to only feel pain if it would aid survival, reproduction, or some other morally beneficial function. Because there is no cosmic intentionality sensitive to the moral value of pain in our universe. We would predict the kinds, amounts, and distributions of pain in the cosmos to appear mostly random. We would predict it to affect the just and the unjust alike. By contrast, if biblical theism is true, then God's infinite power, perfect goodness, and perfect love are reasons to predict our experience of pain to be finely tuned to serve either a biologically useful or morally beneficial function. We seem to have no reason to predict gratuitous or pointless pain if we assume biblical theism is true. Next slide. The next kind of suffering I want to explore is the flourishing and languishing of sentient beings. In order for sentient life to flourish, it must have an adequate supply of food and water, the ability to reproduce and avoid predators, and the ability to remain healthy. Most life throughout the millions of years of sentient history has languished before dying because it was in savage competition with one another for limited resources. Next slide. While alive, only a fraction of sentient beings managed to flourish at all. A smaller fraction managed to flourish for most of their lives, and an even smaller fraction managed to flourish for all of their lives. Additionally, of all the species of animal which have lived on Earth, 99.98% have gone extinct. To quote Carl Sagan again, survival is the exception, and extinction is the rule. Given these facts, how would we predict the world to appear if it were created by God? If my hypothesis is true, then there is no reason to predict that finite creatures should flourish in the struggle for survival, because there would be no cosmic intentionality sensitive to the moral value of well-being. We would instead predict to find that life mostly languishes rather than flourishes in the struggle for survival. By contrast, if biblical theism is true, then God's perfect goodness and perfect love are reasons to predict that God would be sensitive to the positive value of sentient flourishing and the negative value of sentient languishing. We would have reasons to predict sentient life to mostly flourish because that would be relevantly good or worth achieving. Next slide. The last kind of suffering I want to emphasize is that of horrific tragedy affecting finite persons. Our world contains many instances of horrific suffering so intense that the victims or perpetrators believe that their life, on the whole, is no longer worth living. Next slide. Horrific tragedies often destroy a person physically, psychologically, and or spiritually, making spiritual growth impossible. Additionally, many people report never feeling a loving God's comforting presence during horrific tragedies. Given these facts, how would we predict the world to appear if it were created by God? If UCI is true, then there is no reason to predict tragedies to be anything other than silent in the wake of horrific suffering, because there would be no cosmic intentionality who cared about the dignity of persons or the depths of horrors we are capable of experiencing. To spin my earlier Carl Sagan quote, triumph is the exception and tragedy the rule. By contrast, if biblical theism is true, then God's perfect goodness and perfect love are reasons to predict God would be responsive to the overwhelmingly negative value of horrific tragedy. We would not predict God to permit his finite creatures to suffer in ways that are positively soul-destroying. And we certainly wouldn't predict him to appear to abandon someone in the midst of that horrific suffering. With these reason-given facts at hand, we can formulate the following evidential argument from evil. Next slide. My premise A is there are known facts about suffering. My premise B is we have much more reason to predict these facts if we assume my hypothesis is true, than if we assume biblical theism is true. My premise C is that universal cosmic indifference is also a much simpler explanation than biblical theism. Therefore, D, other things being equal, facts about suffering are strong evidence counting in favor of universal cosmic indifference being true and counting against biblical theism being true. In conclusion, Tyler has quite the mountain to climb today. I have argued that when considering and reflecting on facts about suffering, we have much more reason to prefer my hypothesis of universal cosmic indifference than we do biblical theism. How is Tyler to overcome this? I do not anticipate Tyler challenging my premise A, so his criticisms will likely surround my premises B and C. I want everyone to listen carefully to how Tyler responds to these two claims, which are included on your handout, and decide for yourselves whether you think they are satisfactory answers. How am I doing for time? 16 seconds, I think.
Yep.
I'll end it there.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Ben. I'd like to now welcome Tyler to the podium. Once again, his contention is biblical theism does make good sense of facts about suffering. Welcome, Tyler. Yeah, welcome, Tyler.
I'm here too. All right. Your time's up. Sorry about that. I didn't turn my phone on. You ignored your announcement. It's points against it. So I was actually pretty excited. I came in and I realized that my jacket has arm pads. Here are arm pads. Ben did not.
Debate one.
But then I saw that he has that very good-looking beard, which us Reformed people covet. So it's now back to even. So thank you for that. In Primo Levi's masterpiece, Survival at Auschwitz, Levi recalls that while he was suffering from thirst in his barracks, he reached out for an icicle outside of the window. And as he reached for it, a guard snatched it from him, dashed it into a muddy puddle, and told him that he couldn't drink it. Levi asked him, "Varum, why?" And the guard looked at him and said, "Here ice kein Varum. Here there is no why." The greatest terror to our suffering is if the universe presents to us a blank, indifferent face. The unsympathetic, uncaring, valueless universe of atheism can provide no values, no rights, no goodness, or any justification to stand against injustice because nothing would be unjust. Thus, when we see evil in the world and ask of it, why? The only answer the universe can give us back is indifference. Here ice kein Varum. Here there is no why. Without God in the atheist universe, there is no why. And it's not just that we don't know why or we can't understand why. It's that categorically there cannot be a why. As Dawkins says in his famous quote, "In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference." Many have argued that the God on our side mentality is absolutely dangerous, and it's too easily abused to be useful. Well, if the God on our side view is dangerous, what about the nobody is watching view? We've heard Ben argue something very close to that. I will now argue that his view is not only untenable, irrational, and unsupportable, but is actually a flight from conscience, a flight from authority, a flight from God himself. But also that Ben and the entire atheistic and godless community as a whole cannot help but come to borrow concepts from God that they need to make such claims of moral indignation and outrage in the first place. Contrary to Richard Dawkins, the Reformed theologian and philosopher Cornelius Van Til wrote, quote, "The non-Christian needs the truth of the Christian religion in order to attack it. As a child needs to sit on the lap of its father in order to slap its father's face, so the unbeliever as a creature needs God the Creator and the providential controller of the universe in order to oppose God, Without this God, the place on which he stands does not exist. He cannot stand in a vacuum. End quote. Atheists then climb up the ladder of God-given reason and objective morality to stand on their perch and shake their fists at the heavens, but they pretend that they had climbed up completely unaided, or that they never really had to climb at all, that their rooftop dwelling just is a grounded brute fact. I will now turn and show that Ben's argument of universal cosmic indifference and his objection against biblical Christianity fail for at least two critical reasons. First, I will argue that his appeal to simplicity as his only metric for an explanation to be preferable is entirely too myopic and fails to account for numerous other explanatory metrics. Once a more robust understanding of what makes an explanation more preferable than others is introduced, it will be seen that his proposed solution is far too simplistic rather than simple to be plausible. Second, because Ben's argument against the biblical worldview is in the form of what's called an internal critique, which we'll cover, it must account for all relevant concepts within the position that he's trying to defeat. In this case, that is the entire biblical corpus and theological traditions of Christianity. Good luck. I will now show that Ben omits simple and basic biblical concepts in his criticism, which serve as a defeater for his argument. First, what does it mean for something to be a good explanation? Well, philosophers have long debated a bunch of different standards for this, but I can appreciate what Ben thought would be a good standard, what he called reasonableness. Reasonableness he more narrowly defined basically as simplicity plus accuracy. While these are aspects of any good explanation, and I can concede that, they're not the only metrics we use for evaluating explanations. In fact, there's a whole network of explanatory features, and the best explanation falls somewhere at the height of the feasibility zone, of the intersection of these features. First, there's simplicity. Ben has defined this as being measured by the modesty of the claims. We can distill this down to that it has as few relevant metaphysical considerations as possible. As we will see in our later discussion, I'm sure, as far as relevant metaphysical claims are concerned, biblical Christianity is actually far more simple than Ben's view. The next standard is basically that of a lack of personal creativity. It is the explanation too ad hoc. That is, does the explanation exist as a conceptual whole, or must the proponent contend to alter it and add to it and make it this kind of ugly amalgamation in order to make the theory fit the data, rather than vice versa? Thankfully for biblical Christianity, God is defined as a necessary and immutable being. That is literally the definition of something that is not ad hoc. Ben's thesis, as we'll see again in the later discussion, will need numerous modifications and additions to explain the relevant data. Ben also adds to his definition internal coherence, or called accuracy. Really, this should be its own standard and doesn't necessarily fall under simplicity. This metric is basically if an explanation has no internal contradictions, which really would need for any reasonable explanation, or if it has fewer unexplainable internal tensions against the view. But if given the resources available to a view, those tensions can be solved, then that really does not become a problem. Another metric is explanatory power. Ben leaves this off completely. Explanatory power is the idea that the proposed explanation has the resources within itself to actually explain what it's supposed to explain. The explanatory power increases as the intrinsic appeal or plausibility of the explanation rises. We can ask, is the explanation more clearly linked to the subject at hand? Does it explain it in a synthetic or a non-synthetic manner? Does it enjoy an ample supply of evidence or suffer a paucity of evidence? Does it enjoy a majority of affirmation such that it's sufficiently clear to the most people and so forth? Following this, there's scope. I sometimes tell a joke, why are atheists such bad financial advisors? It's because they can't account for anything. This joke gets at the lack of explanatory scope within the view. Scope is a kind of macro-level simplicity. Does the one explanation explain more of the data in question without modification? Does that that one explanation explain other questions and other discourses and other realms of study, and so on and so forth. As I read this list that I think God is the best explanation for, ask yourself, is Ben's thesis of universal cosmic indifference the best explanation? If not, does he need to make additional metaphysical assumptions for things like, why is there something rather than nothing? The cause of the universe from nothing by nothing. The existence of infinitesimally finely tuned quantities and constants of nature in the universe for the existence of rational life. The existence of a realm of abstract, universal, absolute, authoritative, spaceless, timeless, immaterial laws of logic which govern the thinking that takes place in minds. The existence of those minds. Abiogenesis, or the beginning of life from non-life. Specified complexity in genetic information. Personhood. Real and non-illusory intentionality. Non-illusory and substantive free will. The person and work of Jesus Christ, most notably in the resurrection from the dead. The absolute coherence and beauty of the Bible, composed over the course of 1,500 years by 40 different authors on 3 different continents in 3 different languages, and its nearly universally recognized life-changing power. The beginning of the church, from a handful of disparate, underprivileged, and oppressed followers to the world's most followed religion with no signs of slowing globally. And yes, the existence of objective moral values and duties, to only name a few. I think even Ben would need to admit that he needs at least a dozen different and disconnected theories to try to explain all these. I need one. One final explanatory virtue may be added at this point that doesn't often get discussed. That's the feature of transcendental necessity. Now you may be thinking of the term transcendent, where God is seen as above or outside of nature itself, and the terms are related but they're distinct. A transcendental necessity is something that must exist for a subject of the review to exist in the first place. While I'm not going to directly argue it here, I hold to a view that God is the necessary foundation and precondition for the laws of logic and the laws of morality to exist in the first place. That in virtue of creation being something that God accomplished and that human beings are made in the image of God, that whenever we reason or make moral evaluations, we do so from within God's universe. We use the minds that God gave us to reason. That there's an impossibility of the contrary here, whereby categorically no other worldview can provide a foundation for the laws of logic or moral values and duties. This means that Ben is that child crawling up on God's lap to slap him in the face. His moral indignation over things like children dying of cancer is understandable, but only in a God cosmos, where we look around and we see that there is something known that's wrong with the way this universe is. This is not the way that it should be. As Dawkins said at bottom, if there's only blind, pitiless indifference, why is this not the way it should be? Remember, Ben's explanation is titled Universal Cosmic Indifference. The strong prey on the weak. Children get cancer at random. That's just the outworking of nature. There is no why. There's no oughtness. There is no injustice of it all. There is no discord to the way the world should have been. Ben's attempt to use logic and moral evaluation then actually supports my contention. God is the necessary precondition for rationality and virtue. We can only protest because God exists. Ben just cannot help himself from coming over to my Christian lawn. Thanks. But this really should be surprising. Or should not be surprising, I'm sorry. I argue in a paper entitled The Noetic Effects and Effects of Sin and Grace that it's precisely our ability as humans to think of ourselves primarily as created beings, which is removed by sin's effect on the mind. It breaks down what John Calvin called the sensus divinitatis, or the sense of the divine. Our ability to recognize the primary fact of creation, that it is created, and that is including ourselves. That means that when we attempt to reason without God, we will misunderstand the most fundamental aspect of reality and the most fundamental aspect of ourselves, that we are created contingent entities employing our God-given reason. This is the kind of sheer irrationality that is meant by the scriptural passages like Psalm 14:1, where it says, "The fool says in his heart that there is no God." The fool's not stupid. Brent is a brilliant man. He's not a dumb person. But it means that it's irrational on a fundamental level to deny the foundation of rationality to reason. Therefore, this should not be surprising when Ben and other atheists try to use their God-given reason to do exactly what we should expect them to do, to argue for and defend unadulterated self-autonomy. But can it be done? Ben has attempted to show that the God of the Bible is not the best explanation, or for suffering at all, and indeed may even entail contradictions or ethical issues, such as the imposition of what he called undeserved suffering. Let me lay out some of the biblical data about God and creation, about man and the fall into sin, and about the person and work of Jesus Christ that resolves these dilemmas. So we'll now look at why Ben's argument against biblical Christianity fails as an internal critique. An internal critique is a kind of argument like that of a reductio ad absurdum, or an argument to the absurd. A reduction argument assumes that the premises of a position under review to be true, and seeks to show that when this is done, they entail a logical contradiction of some kind. The deductive version of a reductio argument seeks to show that an actual logical contradiction entails. That doesn't seem to be the argument that Ben is going for here. Ben instead presents an inductive or probabilistic form of an internal critique. Here, he thinks that if we assume the truth of biblical Christianity, then what follows are entailments that the believer should find less desirable than we find our commitment to biblical Christianity. That is, he's trying to make the stakes so high that if we want to affirm biblical Christianity, we have to swallow a bunch of very problematic positions that Ben thinks any reasonable person would not want to believe. However, for Ben to make the argument, he must be willing to accept all biblical concepts into the discussion. That's a requirement for Ben to avoid a straw man. For if he's trying to show that on biblical Christianity some undesirable burden has been foisted upon us, it must be within the entire framework of Christianity that this is done. It would do very little for him to argue against a small sliver of that biblical framework. If he does not allow in the full scope of available resources available to the Christian, then he's not dealing with biblical Christianity any longer, and his argument fails. In addition, for the internal critique to work, it cannot rely on assumptions that fall outside of biblical Christianity. If he does that, he actually shifts the goalpost from an internal critique to an external critique. He's no longer asking, is biblical theism coherent? He's now going to an atheistic criticism of biblical Christianity. So he must do it within the canons of biblical Christianity and not of the atheistic worldview. Remember, the question before us is, does the God of the Bible best explain the facts of suffering? Ben and I both bear a burden of proof. He holds the negative and will need to show why he thinks God is not only not a good explanation, but he'll need to provide a better explanation, such that God is not the best. It may be for some that people think God is the best explanation, even if they don't find it particularly compelling. It's like the old saying, capitalism might be the best form of economics, except for everything else. Ask yourself, has Ben positively shown a better view? Let's look at some of those relevant biblical concepts that surely will make up any Christian response to evil, suffering, and ultimate justice. First, there is God, the main character of the Scriptures. The Scriptures tell us important things about God that's relevant to the nature of suffering in the world. First, there are the attributes that are commonly attributed to classical theism, which Ben has covered. There is omniscience, or that God knows all true propositions. Omnipotence, that God can do all logically possible things, and that no outside force or entity can overwhelm or overpower his decrees or desires. There's omnibenevolence, or what philosophers call the good, that God is the good. Not that God is morally bound to some standard, but God is the standard of justice. God is the standard of holiness and righteousness. Holiness is a reference to his absolute purity and goodness. Righteousness is a statement about his justice and his just nature. God both is just the good and the just. Other concepts that are left off from biblical Christianity are things like sovereignty. We all know the saying, "Who are you to play God?" That's because we have in our conceptual framework this idea that God is something categorically different than us. I do not have the right to take a life when I desire. God does. Immutability. God is unchanging in his attributes. There's eternality, that God is not created nor made, that he has no beginning nor end. There's other attributes like aseity, or that God is what is in the Latin, the ase. God does not rely on anything outside of himself for his own existence. We can now move into man, or the main antagonist, and yet at the same time the damsel in distress of the story. There's a great irony about man in the scriptures. There is man as the antithesis, the one who is continually sinning and rejecting God, and yet God, he is the very one that God keeps attempting to save. God is the spurned husband who continually takes back his adulterous wife from self-imposed slavery. Things about man from the Bible. We are imago Dei. We are created in the image of God. And as such, we are rational, moral, personal, and exercise dominion over aspects of creation and so forth. A major category of the fall into sin. Mankind, under the covenant headship of Adam, has plunged into sin, and we actually deserve the wrath of God. God doesn't owe us anything. He doesn't owe us our existence. In fact, our continued existence at any moment is by the mercy and grace of God. There is our sinful persistence, that we are born in sin, we continue in sin, we live in sin, and we die in sin, apart from Jesus Christ. There's sin's impact on the cosmos. Our sin did not just impute moral guilt to humanity, but the cosmos is seen under the lens of sin. It suffers and groans with us until the day that all things are set right, including the cosmos. There is the fact that eternity is set in our hearts, that we are made for another world. You see, the Christian story doesn't end at human death. It continues for all of eternity. So it points us, what happens in this life points us to what happens afterward. So when Ben and other atheists point to see the pointers and the things that are existing in this world, it's like they're, and I don't mean this in a degrading way, but it's like they're the dog that sees the finger pointing but not what it points to. They ignore what the sign represents. And finally, the Bible presents to us the solution to the meta problem of suffering in Jesus Christ. It tells us why and that the world is not supposed to be how it is. The world is off kilter. It's out of whack. It's broken. And we cannot be the ones to fix it. When we're asked what the problem is, the real answer is we are. There is, in one sense, a great irony in Ben's appeal to suffering and evil. He's hitting on one of the strongest tensions that builds within the Old Testament, that rises to a grand crescendo in the coming of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. You see, throughout the Old Testament, this tension builds. How can God remain loving and just? God has promised to call his people to himself, to redeem them, to love them, to set his seal and his affections upon them, and to do it unconditionally. But those people have continually spurned God's law, spit in his face, worship false gods, and hoard themselves out to idols in ways that God's own justice would demand. Final justice, ultimate justice. And so how can God be just and yet faithful to his loving promises? In other words, if the punishment for sin is death, and we've all sinned, and God's nature demands justice, why keep the whole thing going? If we're deserving of death and there's nothing that we can do to make it right, why doesn't God just snuff us all out and start over? Why does God continue to allow us to languish in suffering in this life if we could actually deserve death? Why not just put us out of our misery, send the angel of death, and start over? Jesus Christ is the answer to that in the New Testament. Jesus was the answer that both satisfied God's wrath and displayed his love for his own people most perfectly. God's justice could not allow our sin to go unpunished without him ceasing to be just. But he also did not desire for all of humanity to just be snuffed out in wrath. So what we have on the cross is God, the Creator King, the absolute holy and righteous one, who made all things, humbling himself and coming down to take the punishment that is demanded by his justice, thus fulfilling both justice and love. Now, the cross of Christ may not offer us an explanation for every particular instance of evil or suffering. It may not tell us why this specific person is suffering, why this person's daughter was struck dead by a drunk driver, why this woman's policeman husband was shot dead. It may not tell us about why there is even institutional broad-scale suffering, like what happened in the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide. It doesn't detail the reason for every single natural disaster, like every tsunami that may hit a coast and kill 100,000 people. But it does tell us something important. It tells us that God is not indifferent, that God is not standing aloof, that God is not seated in heaven with his arms crossed looking down on his toy map. That's a pagan concept of God. That's Zeus. That's Thor. That's Odin. That is not Yahweh. That is not Jesus Christ. No pagan god ever came down to suffer an eternity of suffering and bear the scars from the wounds afflicted by the very people he was trying to save. Jesus Christ is not in heaven with arms folded. He's in heaven with arms outstretched. Jesus suffered in Auschwitz, in Buchenwald. Jesus suffers the effects of sin in the cancer ward in St. Jude's. Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. On Ben's view of UCI, rape just happens. Murder just happens. Genocide just happens. Tsunamis and children dying of cancer just happen. They're not right or wrong. They're not corruptions of the way the world should be. They just are. Ben's worldview can offer no ultimate justice and no hope. There's no solution. Because there is no problem. Here, eis kein Warum. In Ben's world, there is no why. But in God's world, the real world, that is under the sovereign control, there is not only a why, there is a hope. And that hope is Jesus Christ. Thank you very much.
All right, we're going to now move into a 40-minute period of moderated discussion. And Tyler, since you just finished up, I'm going to start with you, Ben.
Is my mic?
Yeah, make sure we're all functioning here before we get into this.
I swear I'm an engineer.
Should the light be on?
There we go. Are we good?
Yeah, I think we're
Yeah, okay, excellent. So, great job to both of you. It's great listening to your opening statements, and I'm kind of trying to have my questions focused on where I really see the differences between the heart of the matter, and then maybe we'll get into more of the generalities, depending on how the discussion goes. As I said, my goal here is to make sure that I'm staying out of the way as much as possible and letting you guys interact on the substantive disagreements, and where you really part ways and what you agree on even. And so, Ben, Tyler argues that atheism can provide, I'm quoting him here, atheism can provide no basis for value, rights, goodness, or provide justification to stand against injustice. And of course, if that's the case, then it really changes kind of the face of the debate. So what are your thoughts and how would you respond to that?
Yes, very good question. So Tyler assumes that atheism or forms of naturalism imply some form of moral nihilism, that we can't have any objective moral or normative truths. And so I don't share that assumption with him. So I think that things like morality and rationality are irreducibly normative. So they can't be reduced to something like God's commands or God's nature. So I think that they are functions of reasons. The concept being considerations which count in favor of having a belief or performing an action. So I believe that even if atheism or naturalism is true, that some things still matter in a reason-implying sense, but maybe not necessarily in a command-implying sense. So I'll grant Tyler that things may not matter in the way he thinks they matter, but I think there's a more robust and a better metaethical theory that is called ethical non-naturalism.
Yeah, I think part of my question coming back for that is, for something like that, I have a hard time understanding what that actually even means, and I don't mean that in a pejorative. So, if something is essentially, you're arguing for a brute fact of normative beliefs. I'm not sure, especially if your contention is UCI, that the universe itself is indifferent. We're part of that universe. So if the fabric of the universe is indifferent, if it doesn't care, why should we? Where does
Because we have reason to.
Right, but
What was that, Tyler? Ben, could you say
because
that?
we have reason to. Because that's what reasons are. So we can describe the universe in descriptive ways, the ways you've been describing it as a material world with atoms and molecules, but we can also describe it in normative ways. So we can say that we ought to believe evidence, what the evidence bears out. So that's not a material fact about the universe. It's an irreducibly normative fact about the universe.
right. So irreducibly normative to me just strikes it's a brute fact. That just
Sure,
is what
they're
it is.
brute facts just the way mathematical facts or logical facts or modal facts are just brute facts, or that God's nature just exists as a brute fact.
Right. I'm glad you brought that. So this is where I think the difference is going to come. So I understand what it means for an actually existing entity or something to exist. So I understand what it means for a necessary being to exist. Because there is a metaphysical entity that exists. It just has the property of existing necessarily. I don't know what it means for a normative fact to exist apart from some entities. For example, and I know other apologists have brought this up, these concepts. I don't know what it means, for example, for a normative fact of justice to exist. I know what it means for a person to exist. I know what it means for an act to be just. I know what it means for there to be a person who is the standard of justice. That's what we've got. If you could literally just unpack the concept of what that means. What does it mean for an irreducibly normative fact to exist in the abstract in a way that is incumbent upon us in a normative sense?
That is the very question I was going to ask.
Yeah. So I think one of the mistakes that you're making is that you're thinking of these truths as having ontologically weighty implications. So we could say that mathematical truths, like 7 is a prime number, that truth just exists, but mathematicians shouldn't worry that all of their mathematical theories are false, because there are no Platonic, ontologically weighted numbers somehow in the world. So normative truths are similar to that, and I'll give probably the easiest way to see it is using non-moral examples, that something like rationality. So if we knew that some argument was valid, and we knew that it had true premises, those facts would make it the case, or would give us reason to accept this argument's conclusion. That's a normative conclusion. We would say that we ought to believe this argument's conclusion. We should or must believe this argument's conclusion. So I think morality is much more like fact. And another way of illustrating it is, why should we obey God's commands? Unless there's an irreducibly normative truth that we ought to obey the commands of the divine commander.
Right. So, and this is maybe one more question on this. I don't want to get bogged down in this specific metaphysical question.
It's metaethics, by the way. These are deep questions.
Yeah, and it is, I think, a key difference.
Yeah.
So
Very
it's
true.
worth spending time. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah, so I think for me, what I still would say is that there's a certain amount of assumption on your part that's getting freighted in there. That is, in every one of those analogous examples, mathematics, logic, morality, modality, I would even say, aesthetics. There's this assumption that because we have oughts and needs, therefore I can have normativity in morality. I would just say, well, in all of those cases, we have oughts because God exists. They're all reflections of God's nature and our interaction.
So we wouldn't have to accept the conclusions of valid arguments with true premises unless God told us to?
Well, no, so I'm not a divine command theorist.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
in any way, if God exists, if God doesn't exist, we don't have any reason to follow evidence wherever it goes. We have no reason to accept modal claims or mathematical claims.
This is where I'd fall back and say, well, to me it's a very strange question because I think that if God did not exist, none of that would be possible. None of that
necessarily
would exist.
In any possible world, mathematics is true.
Right.
In any possible world, logic is true.
Right.
In any possible world, pain is bad.
Right. Because in any possible world, a necessary being would exist.
I don't accept that assumption. So that's the assumption you're making.
Right.
And you have an argument for it.
I have it in this case, right?
Yeah.
So
So if I have an ungrounded assumption, you have an ungrounded assumption as well.
correct, but this is where I'm going to push back and say, okay, well, which ungrounded assumption is more conceptually reasonable?
That some things matter.
Right, no, and we agree on that. Right? But I'm going to come back and say, okay, again, going back to I understand, so I can fathom what it means. So for those normative obligations to be grounded in something. So I can understand what it means. For example, I'm not accusing you of Platonism. I know that you reject the view that there are these abstract numbers that are floating around.
I just don't think those questions are clear enough to even answer.
So what I would say is, well, I understand what it means again for those types of concepts to exist in a mind. So that in such a way we can all have these conversations because we all have minds. The question is, well, in the fundamental reality, if there is no personal mind that grounds it all throughout the entire universe, I'm still coming back to while we're both going to say that there's a backstop, that it stops somewhere. There's a backstop. We're not just going to say normativity and reason are completely arbitrary. We just make it all up. There's a backstop for both. I'm going to say I think God is a necessary backstop and functions in a way that we would understand if we weren't specifically aware that we were in this God conversation. We would understand that concepts exist in minds. It's when we come to these questions of the existence of God that we start getting into, well, these abstractions don't exist, but they're brute facts. And I'm not saying that you say they exist in a kind of ontological sense. But they do exist in some conceptual way that
they're just true.
That they're incumbent upon us. And I'm wondering, on your view, where that normativity comes up. Let me actually try to rephrase it. You're going to fall back on an evolutionary model for, I know not the entire universe because evolution is biological, but at least for the development of our persons, our minds, our cognition, all that kind of stuff. Do you think it makes sense to ask the question, is evolution moral?
No, it's not. It's indifferent.
Correct. And I agree with you. I think that question doesn't make any sense.
It might be teleological.
I understand different. So, if it makes no sense to ask if evolution is moral, what sense does it make to say, out of evolution, we have normative obligations? If the system itself has no normative obligations, how are normative obligations rooted in that system?
So the obligations are not rooted in the system. So you seem to be under this a reductionist thesis. You're trying to reduce all these normative truths to something else. And I'm an anti-reductionist. I would try to avoid that reduction at all because I'm an ethical non-naturalist. I don't think that the reductionist project works. So when you say that you need some sort of grounding for these things, I would say no, there is nothing that grounds it because it's irreducible. And so I would say that we are rational animals. We are the types of animals that are capable of responding to reasons in the world. And so that evolution has selected for our rationality. So in the same way that evolution selected for giraffes to have long necks or cheetahs for their speed, we were selected for our rationality. And so just like we have epistemic norms that impose on us, like we should follow evidence wherever it leads, or we ought not to contradict ourselves, I think we have moral norms and practical reason too. We have reason to want to not be in agony. We have reason from an impartial point of view to care about the well-being of all rational creatures. And so when we get into morality specifically, we can have different moral theories of how morality is incumbent on us, I think is the word you used. What was the word you used?
Incumbent, yeah.
Incumbent. So we could say something, the contractualist would say that we ought to act on principles that no one could reasonably reject. So if you notice that every part of my theory of normativity involves the irreducibly normative concept of a reason. So I just don't even need God in the picture because I have this irreducibly normative concept of a reason.
Right. How would you adjudicate then between, so if we said that evolution is a non-moral process, and I understand
it's not an intentional process.
Correct. Yeah, it's not intentional. It itself is not a moral normative process. We know that there are, and this is probably a terrible label. We know there's misfires of evolution. We know that there are non-advantageous avenues that it takes sometimes. What do we do then? What reason do you have then to stand back and say, okay, well, our moral perceptions, our beliefs about the wellness of being,
the
intrinsic value, our belief that which was brought about by our evolution, we were selected for that. How is that in any sense normatively different than the person who is still within within our species that disagrees with that?
So why mistaken? So they're just not there. Like you say, their cognitive faculties wouldn't be functioning properly, and so they would be getting something wrong. Just like someone who has some sort of their cognitive faculties don't allow them to judge the evidence that they have to believe some proposition, and they can make a mistake. Just we're fallible creatures. I think that our cognition is very fallible. I think that it's good, just good enough to have survival value, and so that there are very interesting questions that are raised there about how influence evolutionary natural selection, I should say, has affected our moral and normative cognition.
But are they mistaken that it's
they're just mistaken about moral facts.
But are they mistaken that it's good and right, or are they mistaken on what's useful?
So when you say good, good and right, those are irreducibly. But when you say useful, that could be of instrumental. These are two different kinds of things. Those are just different concepts.
Right, but we freight those concepts with certain value
We make evaluative judgments, like pain is bad, freedom is good, love is good.
Right, but where does the value rise from those within the evolution?
Why is it a contingent thing? Why can't the nature of love give us reason to care about it?
Well, in a theistic universe, I think it can. But
no, that's not my question. I said, why can't love, the nature of love, give us reasons to care about it? I don't think you have an answer to that question.
I do. Again, I'm going to come back to I don't know what it actually means.
Well, that's not a problem from my view, but you don't know what it means.
Well, it is a problem for you if it's not explanatorily clear.
Do you agree that we all have reasons to care about love for its own sake?